All right, John, what's going on, man?
All good, all good. How about you?
Going all right. All right, let's give a few minutes here. See who we get online here.
Rock and roll.
All right, my friend, let's go ahead and kick off the show. First of all, want to introduce both John and I. Um, so this is, I'll confess, this is my first time broadcasting on Twitch. So I'm going to attempt to be both the host and the producer here today. And I'm also relatively new to OBS. So this is going to be a little bit interesting. I'm going to start off. Whenever you do a webinar, I think it's required that you do an intro of who you are. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, first of all. My name is Jason Byrne, and I'm the VP of Software Development at FloSports. I'm also the founder of a site that most of you won't know, but if you know it, you really know it because if you're in the track and field or running space, you certainly will know Miles Split. And I was the founder of that way back in the day. I actually started it back in college and ran that company for a number of years until I sold Miles Split to Flow Sports in 2013, and that's when I joined Flow. Um, all that to say, I'm really, really old. When I started this web development game, I was a young guy, and everybody was, "Oh, wow, you know so much for being young." And I don't know, it seemed like I blinked my eyes, and all of a sudden now I'm one of the old guys. So I don't know how that happened, but I've been around web development since 1994, back when I was in middle school, and you name the technology, I've done it. Um, I said I founded MileSplit in college, and then and kind of bootstrapped it for a number of years. Had a few jobs. I was a Spanish teacher at Lake Brantley High School for like a minute, and then I was a IT director at a small company around here, and then finally was able to go full time on MileSplit before joining Flow. Um, Today at Flow Sports, I manage a team of engineers, and I also kind of say lead architect as well as kind of head of R&D. So I get to do a lot of fun projects here. Here's some contact information if you want to get in touch with me. Here's some of the best ways to publicly to do that. If you're on part of ODEVs, welcome. We love our ODEVs crew. Hit me up on Slack there. Also LinkedIn, Twitter. My personal homepage, jasonseaburn.com, because somebody took jasonburn.com, and or email me. Those are great ways. And I want to toss it over next to John Sickels, and you'll see both of our faces in webcam here in a minute. But John, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm John Sickels. I'm a QA engineer with FloSports. Been with the company for close to 5 or 6 months. Been working with Flagpole since I got started. A little bit of my background as well, too. I started my web development journey back when MySpace was allowing us to alter the HTML. I would run some fun scripts just to do some fun stuff. Whatever I could automate, I'd do it. I started testing probably last year. So I specialize in test automation. Big reason why I have my hands all on Flagpole all day. Also a little experience with Cypress, a couple of other tools as well too. But excited to share what Flagpole has to offer. Add me on LinkedIn, see what I'm up to. Uh, Good there.
And there's John.
Hi,
Say hi, John.
hello everyone.
Cool. Yeah. So I wanted to add one more part about Flow Sports. Well, first of all, John's amazing. He's been a great addition to our team. Super excited to see all the progress that he's already made, and it's going to be a lot better going forward. We'll talk more about that coming up. Quick introduction to Flow Sports. So essentially, we are an online sports media streaming company, which means exactly right now during COVID-19, we have very little to do, which is an interesting place to be in. But hopefully, once we stop social distancing, we'll be back in business. But we have a large following in what we call uh, underserved fans. And what underserved fans are is if you're a fan of the NFL, NBA, D1 college football, D1 college basketball, and a lot of the other major sports, you can turn on your TV, you can watch your sport anytime. But there's a lot of audience out there, wrestling, track and field, gymnastics, who aren't served by the major networks. And there's also a lot of fans in the major sports that aren't served by the major networks. For example, if you're a fan of the CAA, Colonial Athletic Association, which is a D1 conference, but not your Florida Gators or Seminoles or whatever, you're not going to see your sports. So that's why we focus on the niche of those underserved fans who can't get their content anywhere else, are craving it. And if you're a wrestling fan, you can see one day of wrestling, maybe 2 days of wrestling on ESPN, but you're a fan 365. So we stream these sports and to a passionate audience. So that's what Flow Sports is. We have headquarters in Austin, Texas. We have an office in north of Orlando in Longwood, which is where John and I are based. And we have remote developers all over the country as well. We have about 45 engineers on the team. So we love it. It's a great place to work. All right. So without further ado, let's get started talking about introduction to Flagpole. We're going to do kind of three phases today. First, I'm going to tell you about Flagpole, what it is, why we developed it, rather than using something off the shelf. And then I'm going to hand it over to John to talk about some of the things he's done, and then we'll actually do a demo, just up and running from 0 to 60, getting a Flagpole running, so you can kind of jump into the code in the CLI. So what is Flagpole? First of all, it's a QA automation framework. It was actually developed to start with in a hackathon, interestingly enough. So I just let's see if we can do this. We threw it together and it worked pretty well. So we kind of kept going with that hackathon. It's open source. It's available on GitHub and npm. It's written completely in TypeScript, which means you get all the type goodness and autocomplete, and it's awesome. And while we're still young and immature and still iterating, and you're probably going to find some bugs, it is on its second version, and we've been doing this for about a year. And this next item, I will say it should run on any platform. However, we run Macs, so as you guys start running this, if you're Windows based, please let us know. I can imagine a couple issues with different paths, with forward slash or backslash in the past, that may present issues on Windows. We'll have to test that very soon, but please let me know those issues you have. But we'll be able to fix it quickly. And lastly, again, issues, feedback, PRs as you guys start to use this, hopefully contribute to it, or let me know what you find or want to find. So a little bit of history of the engineering and QA at Flow Sports, which maybe will give you a window into why we developed this. 2 years ago, I think that we were not in a great place. Our QA and engineering teams were effectively two separate teams, and so our engineers would do the work. They would complete the ticket. They would mark it ready for QA, and then from their perspective, they were done with it. We said they threw it over the wall, right? Now it's QA's job, and we weren't doing dev deploys. QA actually took the ball from testing it to deploying it, and that led to this dichotomy where there's two separate teams, and they treated each other as two separate teams. Um, and adversarial is not the right word, but there was a little bit of like, devs wanted to be done, and if QA kicked it back to them, there was kind of this like, um, we weren't functioning as one team, and our QAs were also not integrated into our dev process. So when they got the ticket, a Jira ticket, and they were supposed to QA it, they needed a lot of details to know what to actually test for, because they weren't part of the process of creating it. So we fixed a lot of these things, fortunately. We're also in a place where we had minimal automation. Part of that reason is because we have what I call a QA analyst and a QA engineer. A lot of our folks were analysts, which means they were doers, they were testers, they were thorough, they were detailed, but they weren't engineering wasn't their native tongue. And so, they were very comfortable taking it and manually testing all the things, but that only scales so far. So what we want to do is take our analysts and help them become engineers. Um, as I said, they're mainly doing manual testing. They use a few tools like Ghost Inspector and RunScope, which are cloud-based testing things. And developers were doing completely separate tests with some unit tests. Hopefully, I say that because some of our projects are better than others with unit tests, um, and building their own separate functional testing. There was no kind of integration. And the last part of this is, I think it's funny because I would talk to our QA engineers, our QA analysts, really about automation, and they would tell me they were too busy to automate. We're doing so many things, there's so many projects, we can't stop to automate. And I think that's the funniest thing ever because that's the exact reason that you automate when you're really, really busy. So it's just kind of ironic in my opinion. Um, so why did we make Flagpole? And I have this slide here because there's some really great tools out there, and I will specifically acknowledge Cypress. Cypress is a really great QA tool. A lot of people use it. It's really well supported. So why in the world did we make Flagpole? And Cypress is evolving and has evolved in the 1 or 2 years since I started Flagpole. But here were some of our goals. We wanted our tests, our functional tests, not just our unit tests, and to live in the same repository as the code. Why? Because when we're using RunScope or Ghost Inspector, these cloud-based things, there's no way in heck our developers are gonna log into this other system and write tests for it. And I want not just our QA engineers writing tests. I want our developers writing tests. I want this to be owned collectively, right? Um, we also wanted it to be integrated everywhere. We wanted whenever we do a git push or a commit, we want a git hook to kick off and run our tests right away locally. Whenever we deploy, push it and it deploys to staging, we want it to deploy automatically. Whenever we, push it with a version tag and we want and in our CI/CD pipeline and it should go to production, we also want it to run. We want it to run on a scheduled cron job. So we need this thing that can run across the entire spectrum of our pipeline. Um, so we also wanted a single framework for all types, and we'll talk about a little bit later the types of tests that we have. But we don't want to write one set of tests for browser tests, one set of tests for API tests, like we were doing with like Ghost Inspector and RunScope. We want one platform for all. We also want it to be fast, especially when we're doing it on Git hooks, Git commits. We can't developers are always going to skip the test if it takes more than 10 seconds or 15 seconds, right? They don't want to sit around for minutes every time they try to push or commit. So we got to find ways to make it fast. A lot of the frameworks I tested, including Cypress, were simply had no way to run them quickly. I'm gonna I want to power through here, but TypeScript, IntelliSense, we've got to have a single syntax that both developers love and QAs are quick to learn. And so again, a lot of our QA people are analysts, and I want to get them to be engineers, but they're not engineers first. So we can't have some really hard to understand language. So we have to make sure it was easy to follow with an easy syntax. I'm about to hand it over to John, but last thing I'll mention is that Flagpole, I said the different types of tests that we can support. We can run HTML DOM tests, which most testing frameworks don't bother with. But a lot of times you can get away without running a full browser. And if you can, you should because it's super fast. And that's what allows us to run those tests within 15 seconds, where you can barely get Puppeteer or any browser started in 15 seconds. We can run the browser test if we need to. We can run API tests if we need to. Flagpole is not for unit tests. It's also not for load tests. But we can also do some other things like screenshot compares. We can test images for height and width. We can do some basic style sheet testing, XJS if you know what that is, and some other testing, other genres of tests really that you could build out on your own on top of Flagpole. But the three on the left, HTML browser API, and maybe the screenshot compares are probably the most awesome. Oh, sorry, one last slide just to level set on terminology. A suite is a group of tests and a suite contains scenarios, which are kind of individual tests, like testing a home page and then testing another page. Each of those would be a scenario, and then assertions are kind of the individual line item tests that we make within each scenario. I also want to mention when I talk about environment, I'm talking about production, staging, development, and finally CLI is command line interface. All right, I've talked way too much. So I'm going to transition over to John, and let John share his experience with getting started with Flagpole a few months ago.
Thank you, Jason. A little bit more about my background. I come from a boot camp as a student, so I have a little bit of web development experience. From there, I picked up a little bit of freelance work as a script runner with Cypress. So a couple of weeks, couple of months, maybe you're writing scripts, building some test suites. When I came to Flagpole, Jason explained to me the sort of hole in automation, how I needed to fill that as an advocate to get everyone on the same page to go ahead and start using this awesome tool to get your tests automated, start eliminating these QA analyst ticket times, start hyperlining your deploy process, and everything in between. So not only do I write the tests on the critical paths and the user stories, but I also find the best way to implement them to increase coverage, and then how to get these flagpole tests running in different environments, like in the cloud, on Circle CI, in your Git push, pre-push Git hook, and a lot of fun stuff like that. So first coming up on Flagpole, I started in sort of like a JavaScript development. So very simple, very flexible, very legible kind of test suites I was writing. Started off, simple, what do you need first? So we started doing some smoke tests on critical paths. So the Cheerio DOM HTML testing came super handy with that. I was able to go ahead and start writing assertions pretty much my first week. So put in my very first push, first week on the homepage, asserting there's an H1, this image is loading. I have a list of athletes or runners on milesplit.com, and it was a pretty quick process from there. So once I got the hang of that, a week or two later, Jason pointed out the sort of TypeScript. I found myself going to the docs a lot, looking for the different methods, the different assertions, all the different properties and stuff I could access. Then once we got the IntelliSense and VS Code with TypeScript, it was really kind of off to the races from there. So I just hitting that property accessor and seeing all the different things that I could do with it was really incredible. So again, it was quite a easy translation, moving from just a tiny bit of Cypress experience. Now I'm writing these HTML DOM smoke and sanity tests. Started writing some functional browser tests as well. So once I got, you look at the QA analyst role, like Jason had mentioned, a ticket comes in, it's ready for release. It could take an hour, a couple of hours before that deploy goes out. You got to run through, you're looking at the details. With Flagpole, you can check how every single page on your application works in seconds. And this is not, having to load any sort of browser or do any sort of navigation, but, simple pull on that DOM, make these assertions, you're good to go. So that's why we have our DOM smoke tests on a pre-push Git hook. Is your code, from an eagle eye, bird's eye perspective, ready to go? It's super easy to go ahead and get that set up. And then Jason briefly mentioned screenshots as well. So this is something super powerful. Even if you don't want to write any code, do it in a couple of lines. You can have a screenshot of your control. This is what I want it to look like. And you'll have an assertion that'll pull up your application in your chosen environment, take a screenshot of it, and then compare it. You'll have a certain threshold that'll either pass or fail, which is incredible because you can do this all in a day. So it's pretty easy to set up, especially, if you have any JavaScript experience, period, async await promises is good to go because you npmi flagpole init, and I'm sure we'll run through a demo with all of that, but you can set up your bird's eye visual, you can kind of even call it AI testing with screenshots on all your routes, and you can get your entire application screenshot smoke tested in a day. So that was pretty incredible.
And I want to call out real quick Matt Mulford, who's another developer of ours here in Orlando. And so we didn't actually initially have this image compare as a feature of Flagpole, and but Matt was able to kind of build it on top of Flagpole, and he showed me how he had done that, and I'm like, this is awesome. And so we were able to integrate that into the core of Flagpole, which was pretty cool. That again, see how people want to use it, and then we can bring it into the main process. And I want to kind of just recognize how far we've come in a short period of time with our mile split testing with John. Like John started basically in December, um, and we had like when I say no, I think we maybe had 3 tests and they weren't even ever run, right? So we had basically no testing, and I said, John, I want this full thing of testing, and so what we started out doing was just identifying all the critical paths, and then we kind of expanded upon those. Like now you got the critical paths, like here's the other paths, and we kind of started identifying, writing those out in a document that John kept track of which ones he had covered. And fast forward between essentially January, because December is always a lost month. Between January and now in April, we have really good test coverage, like hundreds of tests that run all the time, and the developers are actually super excited. And John gets called a rock star like constantly by our mile split developers. And we're looking forward to moving him to some of the other projects to help expand that as well. Right, John?
You're too nice. Thank you.
No, no, you deserve it. Cool.
Yeah, well, I mean, I found something on Google, build it, break it, and build it again. So, I learned a lot by trial and error. I'd write a test, and I'd figure this is not what I want. I was always in between being either too picky or, not detailed enough. So
Yeah.
once you find that sweet balance and you really kind of know how it all works, and you can just plug and chug and you're good to go.
Yeah, we have one question in the chat I want to answer. So the question says, how did you come up with the name Flagpole and the logo? So um, naming is hard in general, right? Not just in coding, it's hard, but also coming up with names that haven't been taken out there on the internet. So first of all, Flagpole wasn't taken, so that was a plus. But no, what it really means is there's a saying, I want to run it up the flagpole. So when you say run it up the flagpole, it can have different connotations, but a lot of times it's like I want to throw this out there and see if it's works, see if it's a good idea, So the idea is we're gonna take our code that we think is good and we run it up the flagpole and see if it really is. And then it comes back and says, cool, we can deploy it. So that's kind of the name of Flagpole, is running up the flagpole. And as far as the logo goes, one of our part of the hackathon, one of our designers, Arian Archer, when she thought of Flagpole, she thought about like, I don't know if it was salute your shorts or whatever, but she thought about like running your underwear up the flagpole because it's a thing apparently. And so that's what it is. So we thought it was fun, so we went with it. Cool. So anything else that you wanted to add before we kind of jump into the demo, John?
Yeah, I mean, that was just touching the HTML tests. The functional browser tests are great. This is something that I was used to, seeing a browser, clicking on this, navigating to here, and it was pretty interesting to see, how easy that was to set up. You have the headful option, so you can manifest a physical browser while you're writing your tests to help debug that. Just throw in comments in your test suites as well too, so you can make assertions on data as it's passing through. And then to wrap up the API testing, which is what I've been especially working on for the last month with MileSplit, I successfully got 100 different routes and requests with the Flagpole API MileSplit suite, which has been really, really awesome. It's just been so far a pleasurable experience. I like seeing all the green check marks of passing, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't like seeing a failure too, because that's a little opportunity to find some more assertions and data, and it's really cool. And then the language too, is you can use the same language. This is not really difficult for someone or a developer, especially if these guys are in PHP, if they want to pick up some JavaScript or TypeScript. It's not something that was difficult at all, because you can write your API, your functional browser, your DOM smoke tests all in the same language was super amazing, because quality, like you said, is a team effort. So once it is set up and we're happy with the coverage, the goal now, me as an automation advocate, is to get these test suites to come out with new features.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like one mob programming or pair programming session that says, hey, here's how you get started, 1 hour tops, can get these developers on board with writing test suites, even if it's just one single assertion. Status code 200 on this page is one more than we had yesterday. So having these tests come out with features is super easy. You get it set up, you get the ball rolling, and you're good to go for ever.
Yeah, I mean, it's super important to get developers to buy into it. And as I said earlier, we want developers to write tests, not just QA to write tests. And that's scary to both developers and QA when you first drop that on them. It's scary for developers because they're used to like, well, I don't want to write tests. I just want to write code and yeah, let somebody else handle the test. It's also scary for some of our QA guys when I first said that because they're like, well, then what am I going to do if developers writing the test? Are you trying to fire me? I'm like, no. We ideally want it to be a collaboration. We want our QA engineers to be the advocates and get people on board, get people excited about it, and kind of give it a base to jump off on, and then ramp up these guys to be able to do it. And it all by getting that buy-in, we also eliminate kind of the animosity between the teams, and or like whenever we don't have a good enough selectors in the HTML to actually grab the things that we want to test against, and normally it's like wrestling with the engineers to get them to add like some sort of data QA tag that you can grab or some ID tag that makes your life easier. But if they're writing the tests, then they have a vested interest to make it
Oh, what
easier.
a dream.
And they don't want to break their tests, and so it gets buy-in when we get all in the same repo and everybody collaborating. So anyway, and John becomes more like a coach for the testing. So it's pretty cool. All right, ready to jump into the demo?
Ready.
Let's do it. All right, let me again, I'm trying to be producer and juggle two different screens here. So I think we can see my code screen. Actually, I don't want to just see the code. I want to see the terminal. So let me share this one. Okay. So what I've got going on here is I've got a project with basically nothing in it. And sorry, I keep switching screens on here. Let me zoom out a little bit here. All right. So this is just basically a dummy project I set up. I'll just acknowledge the fact that there's an SRC in here, but it just HTML, it's nothing. Like literally, I just set this up so it looked like a project. So we have SRC and dist. We have our node. So I've already npm and knitted this project so that there is a package file, but there's no dependency. So basically, we're starting from 0 on this project. And so one of the first things that we're going to do to start using Flagpole is you need to install Flagpole globally. So to do that, we're going to do npm I and g/g, so that says install it globally, and Flagpole. And so this will allow us to use the Flagpole CLI across our entire system. And I've actually already done this. If it takes too long, I'll just Control C and get rid of it, but hopefully it doesn't take too long. I'm gonna have to do this. Okay, cool. So now the Flagpole is installed. So if I run the Flagpole command, it gives me some nice output. We don't really care for now what that output is, but the CLI is now installed. The next thing what you got to do is we have to install Flagpole within this particular project. It's a little bit annoying that we've got to install it 2 places, but that's life. So we want to install this as a dev dependency. Hopefully you guys are already familiar with npm. If you're not, figure it out because it's awesome. So if we do npm --save dev and type Flagpole, that's going to install Flagpole within this specific project. So we're going to go through this, unfortunately, the same process again, but take about 30 seconds here.
I got tests running faster than that.
You sure do. And this is a live show, folks, so if I run into any errors, I apologize ahead of time. Stuff happens, but we'll keep our fingers crossed. It's like that Bill Gates demo when like got a blue screen of death in the middle of it. I don't know if you remember that. If you guys are old enough, probably not.
When Elon Musk threw his steel ball at the new car.
Right. All right.
See?
So if you notice above here, if you can, hopefully it's big enough, you can see now we have Flagpole listed as a dev dependency. Cool. So now Flagpole is in this project, but we still don't have Flagpole in the project completely, because the next thing we got to do now that we have the dependency installed, we're going to use our CLI and we're going to type Flagpole init, and that's going to create our config file. It's going to ask us a few questions, kind of like npm init would do. So it's going to, what do you want your project to be called? Next question is what environments do you want to use? So if the screen's a little bigger, you'd see, what environment do you want to support? Today I'm just going to say dev and prod. Normally we might say dev, stag, and prod, but you can set up the different environments that you want to support. So we do that, and it's going to ask me what my default development domain is. So I'm going to say mile split .local, which is what we use internally for our local development. And then what do we want to use for our production URL? I'm going to say milesplit.com, which is our production site. And next, do you want to use TypeScript? Of course I want to use TypeScript because, why would anybody not want to use TypeScript? I mean, really. Zoom in. There's a little closer. Maybe you can see this better. So yes, I want to use TypeScript. It's going to ask me a couple more questions. Where do I want my test to live? I want it to live in a test folder. That's the default. My test source folder is going to be where my TypeScript lives. And my test out, you could change that to dist if you prefer, is going to be where my tests live. Cool. So what did that do? If you, it created a flagpole.json file, which you can see here. Just has kind of my basic configuration. It also created my test folder with an empty src, an empty out folder, and a tsconfig folder. So that is what the flagpole init did for us. So now if I run flagpole list, which is a command that lists out all of our test suites, it says did not find any test suites. That's because I haven't created any suites yet. So that's, of course, the next thing that we're going to do. So to do that, intuitively, I just type flagpole add suite. My command line, it says, what do I want to call it? I'm going to call it smoke. And I'm going to just go with the defaults here. We're going to test the home page. It says what type of test do we want to run. So it has our three major test types here listed: HTML, a REST API in JSON, or a browser test. The HTML test is just the DOM testing, which is with Cheerio, which is basically like jQuery for Node. It's super fast. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And I'm just going to kind of zoom through these different defaults. And you'll see in my flagpole config, it created this new entry. And in my test folder, it also created a new TypeScript file called smoke.ts. And so that configures a very basic test, and this is actually going to be a runnable test for us. One more thing I need to do before I run it is I'm going to type flagpole build. And what does flagpole build do? Essentially, it's TSC. It transpiles our TypeScript into JavaScript so we can actually run it. So we do flagpole build. It's going to transpile that. Usually it moves faster than it is right now. I don't know if the video is getting in the way of it. Come on, friend. My computer sounds like it's going to take off. There we go. That took way too long for that simple test. But essentially all that did is went into this test folder and ran TSC for us. And so you'll see now I have a smoke.js in my out folder. So now that we've done that, I'm going to type flagpole run. And when I type flagpole run, this is actually a new feature I rolled out last night. I don't know if John likes it or not yet. Flagpole run used to run all of the tests, but now I have it doing this nice thing where it asks you what you want to run, which I think is better personally. But it says you want to run all tests, choose by suites, by tag, or none. I'm just going to say run all because we only have one anyway. And so it's going to run this test. And it failed. Oh no! Why did it fail? Well, it failed because I'm running against local. And I don't have my local milesplit environment up and running. So that is actually a fully expected failure. So that is because by default, it's going to run it against my dev. But I actually want to run it against prod because I don't want to bother getting my milesplit local repository up yet. So to fix that problem, first of all, I'm going to do a -- all so it doesn't ask me again. And I'm going to just to run all tests. And I'm also going to do a -e prod, which tells it to run in the prod environment. And this time, hopefully it passes. And it does. So this test isn't incredibly meaningful. However, it does indicate that it was able to access our homepage, and it got back at 200, and it was, we got back HTML. Looks good. But we, of course, want to do much more than that, don't we, John?
Oh, yeah.
So one of the first things we might want to do is we might want to, let me change the view so you can see the code a little bit tighter. We might want to test to see that there is an article on the page. So to do that, I'm going to do articles, articles. So I'm going to create a constant called articles. I'm going to await. Hopefully you guys are familiar with the async await interface with TypeScript and JavaScript. And then I'm going to use my context, which is what we call an assertion context. It's kind of the powerhouse. Most of the time, we're going to be using this context variable, which is right here, to do pretty much everything. And through the glories of TypeScript, we can see all the wonderful things that we can run. And what I want to do is I want to make sure that we have articles on the page. Okay? Does that, John? If you ever see me writing any code that doesn't look good, because you do this on a daily basis, please interrupt me and tell me if I'm screwing anything up. But hopefully, I'm doing the right things here.
There's two things. Can you show your Explorer first, just to kind of
Yeah,
show the layout of where the tests are living? Because I
sure.
think it was cut off when you were showing that
Oh,
off.
okay. All right. Can you see it now?
I cannot.
In Twitch. How about now on Twitch? It's delayed by
There
just
you
a
are.
second. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So, sorry if that was cut off before. So through the stuff that we set up earlier, we have a test folder here with an src and an out. And so my TypeScript is going to go in that test/src folder. So I have my smoke.ts in there, which is what I'm currently working with.
And then one confusing thing for me as well when I got started is what exactly is context? We're doing context assert and context exists and context
If you don't like the
response.
name context, you can change this variable actually to anything that you want. But essentially, it just gives us it's what I call it an assertion context, but it's within a certain scenario. It's has all the things that you need. It has your response. It has your request properties. It has you make assertions with it. It's kind of your powerhouse that makes your life a lot easier to do any kind of stuff against.
And then for clarity, line 3 is your suite declaration.
Yes, okay, sure. We can get into that a little bit. So the first thing that we have to do within Flagpole, and all this was done for us when we typed in the CLI commands, we have to define our suite. And so again, a suite is a collection of scenarios. So this first line 3 is just we're going to define a suite, and we're going to call our suite basic smoke test of the site. Okay, and then down here within the suite, these next two lines is creating an HTML test, which again is our Cheerio DOM only test. That's called homepage load. So this is actually defining a scenario within that basic smoke test of the site suite. And this next line says we want to open our homepage, which is just our slash after our domain. And then in the next is where we actually start defining our assertions. Does that about cover it, John?
Yeah, all good.
Cool. So this line here, what we're doing is that we are checking that article. Actually, articles is not what I want to check. I want to check article. So what it's going to do is do basically a CSS selector on the page for all the article tags. Yes? Yes. So now if I do flagpole build, hopefully it goes faster this time. And then I do flagpole, I'll go back up, flagpole run prod. And it passed, not only passed, but we also see that article exists. Cool. Well, we have that. That's great. But we probably want to do more than just test that it exists. We also want to test that there's a certain number of them. I don't know how many article tags there will be, but I'm just going to make this up and wing it. So let's just assert that. So now we saved articles. This will save this articles tag that pulled back in to this articles constant here. So I'm going to make an assertion. So I'm going to assert that articles has a length of greater than 5, 4? I don't know. We'll say 4. Does that sound good? Again, John, tell me if stop me if I go awry here.
Sure. There's 50 articles on that page. I
well,
think.
then we should then that should pass, right? So we'll run that again, and I don't know. I'm gonna change this to find all. Exist may just return the first one. So let's do it. So I think exist just returns the first article.
Yeah, exists will find and then assert that it exists and then exit.
Yeah. So if I do find all instead of exist, it should grab all my articles and hopefully this passes. There we go. Yay. So the length of that array is greater than 4. By the way, so by default it typed in the title of this length of array, which isn't extremely telling. we might want something more descriptive. So we can actually add a string as a first argument here optionally and say there are at least 4 articles, right? So we can do that so that whenever we get the pass or failure, we actually can understand better what it's testing for. And we're in that again. You should see my new thing I typed in. Yeah, there are at least 4 articles. So now it actually can start making sense. I don't want to dive too far into these, but again, through the magic of TypeScript, you can see a lot of things that you can do. So you can test find, will find a single element. Find all is going to find all the elements matching that CSS selector. And hopefully you guys out there know what CSS selectors are. You can find having text. You can find with XPath. You can do a bunch of different stuff in here. You can take a screenshot. Select is actually when like we're using a browser test, we can like select from a drop-down menu. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff you can do. You can check out the docs, but you can also just kind of play around with the magic of TypeScript and autocomplete. All right, so we have a test. It's working. I could, of course, do a whole lot more tests. I can show you different selectors. John, is there any? I was going to jump to API tests next, but is there anything else while we're messing with HTML tests you want me to show them how to do?
One of the cool things I loved was the setting cookies for authorization, authentication,
Okay.
making sure the user can see stuff like that really quick, just that as possible. You don't have to run through the whole thing.
Yeah. So again, through autocomplete, if I go up here within my scenario and I type dot, I also see a lot of things I can set on my scenario itself. And what is it? It's called set basic authentication. I should know. Oh, there we go. Set basic auth. So if you have a page that has a bearer token or has basic authentication in this case, so for example, our staging, you can't access our staging site without providing what's called basic auth, username and password. So if I type this in, I can put in my username, foo, and my password. Password. Why is it yelling at me? What am I doing wrong, John?
It needs to be an it is a type object.
Oh, now it's VS Code just needed a minute to reconcile itself. Cool. So yeah, so we could easily set that. We can also set cookies. So you saw bearer token. You can set cookies. So what we have to do a lot of times is we have to, for some of our pages, we have to go get a token. So we go to our API, we like log in, and it gives us back a token, and then we have to set the bearer token, or we have to set a cookie for the identity. But we have to do all these. Yeah, we can set headers. So anyway, that would allow us to log in. So basically anything that you need to do to set the headers on the page, you can do that all that stuff here, and it's very very intuitive. I mean, if I want to set a header, it's exactly what you would expect. I mean, I could set X my header, right, and add some value, and it's going to set it for us, right? So it's again the idea is through the autocomplete, like everything is super intuitive that you can figure out how to do whatever you need to do. That cover it, John?
Yeah, yeah. My favorite thing, especially if you're doing like a paywall check, you can have 3 different scenarios on the suite with 3 different, cookies or lack thereof. So the first one's not logged in. The first
Mm-hmm.
one is a logged in non-paid user. So you should see a paywall. Third one's a paid user. You should not see a paywall. So that's really cool to have in like one test suite, especially with these fast DOM smoke tests. Setting cookies, getting your API token, applying it to the scenarios, super fast, easy, cohesive, ready to go.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things as I mentioned earlier, we do with mouse split is before you do any of this, you need to define on paper or in a doc what are the scenarios that I actually want to cover, right? So we need to say, well, if I'm you can do personas or whatever you want to do. If I'm a not logged in, what should I see on the site? If I am logged in, I should see this. But if I'm logged in and I'm a paid user, I should see this. And so you identify, as John was just saying, all those different scenarios, and each one of those can be a different scenario in Flagpole, and you can do it all in the same thing. So you would have 3 different users or whatever, and yeah, and you just set those different cookies to identify yourself as a different user and make sure that you see the right things. So we have a question. So just making observation. Please tell me if this is true. The whole Flagpole package seems much lighter than Cypress. I'm guessing part of that is not having the separate GUI and being designed entirely in terminal CLI. I would say that's the case. So Flagpole again can run in different modes. It can run right now we're running just a basic DOM test, which again is lightning fast because it's gonna just grab the HTML and it's gonna do stuff with the HTML. It doesn't load a browser. It doesn't. This is also a downside because it doesn't render your CSS. It doesn't render your JavaScript. It just grabs the DOM. Sometimes that means you can't run this kind of thing if you're using a SPA. So typically, your SPA renders everything in JavaScript. So if you run an HTML test against a SPA like Angular, typically it's not going to work because if you just grab the HTML, you're not going to have the DOM yet because it has to render. However, when you do things quote the right way, there's a thing called Angular Universal. So all the flow sites, FlowTrack, Flow Wrestling, they all are Angular and they're all a SPA. However, we do server rendered HTML initially, which means we can use these fast HTML tests. So I don't want to go too far down that, but if you do have server rendered SPA, then that initial request will come with that HTML pre-rendered, and then you can do all this stuff super fast. If you don't, then these fast HTML tests that we're doing right now, you're going to have to actually do a browser test, which we'll get to if we have time, but that just runs the full Puppeteer. And when you get to that point, you're more like Cypress. Flagpole itself does not ship with Puppeteer. And if you follow the docs, it will kind of walk you through. If you want to run Puppeteer, you have to run npmi Puppeteer, which will install it within your application. So once you do that, then you can use Puppeteer. But we try to keep Flagpole as light as possible, and a lot lighter, a lot faster than Cypress especially if you can do these HTML tests. Hopefully that answered the question. Yakalib, one of our colleagues, says definitely more versatile than Cypress, and it wraps and contains the libs purely in API testing, server render, DOM checks, headless Chrome testing with Puppeteer, HLS validator, etc. Yep. Yeah, we love the flexibility. We love being able to do a lot of different things. All right, well, let me do an HTML test. So we can see that in the same suite, we can also test I said HTML, I meant API. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a scenario to our existing suite. So I'm going to type Flagpole add scenario, if I can spell scenario correctly. And so the first thing it's going to do says, what suite do you want to add it to? Well, we only have one suite so far, so it's an easy choice. And now it's going to say, what type do we want to add? This time I'm going to add a REST test. What do I want to call it? Pull something from the API, whatever. And then if I can remember what one of our unguarded APIs, which possibly I shouldn't share with the world, but it's fine. Cool. So you'll see when I type that CLI command, it automatically inserted that kind of starter code in my scenario, which is nice because, I don't know about you, but I ended up copying and pasting code a lot because I don't know, I just never can remember all the stuff I need to do to kind of get it going. So having the CLI like pop in like my boilerplate to start with, like, helps me at least. You could of course type this manually and you wouldn't have to do what I just did, but why not? So what this is going to do is, if I remembered my paths correctly, and again, John, stop me if I didn't. It's going to just do a simple HTML or JSON test. If I build this and run this, it should basically make sure that it came back with valid JSON. And that's all it will do without anything inside the next. So let's go ahead and run that again. Awesome, it passed. Good. Whew. It's always a relief doing this live. So you'll see in that same test, first we're testing an HTML homepage, making sure the DOM loads, but that same suite, we're also able to test the JSON. And so it's basically pulled that, made sure we got our expected response, and it made sure it's valid JSON. That's well and good, and you might want to do that and just make sure that all your API endpoints work, and maybe that's all you want to do. But typically you want to do a little bit more than that. So in the same syntax that we used above, when we're selecting within an HTML DOM, we can select within our JSON response, which again was one of the goals because we don't want to have to learn a new syntax for every different thing that we do. So I should have tested this a lot more because I'm just going from memory, and I'm everything I type, I'm paranoid it's going to break something. Um, but I but I'm going to try to be positive. So if I remember my JSON structure correctly, there should be a data element. And so I'm going to find that, and then I could just do exists, but I'm going to do context assert data, and then we can do exists, and it basically does the same thing. Um, and let's build that and run that again. And it does, yay, data exists. Okay, great. So what is data? I believe that data, in this case, we're pulling a list of meat, so data should be an array, and that array should be have a length greater than 0. So if I just assert against that data again and type equals, John, again, I need your help because I'm just so paranoid I'm going to type something incorrect here. So assert, then I'm going to assert data length is greater than 0. Look good, John?
So far, I'm paranoid data might be I-value type. You might have to access the object with $,
Oh yeah, I might
or I
have to do
could
that.
be
We're gonna
could be
find out, and
mistaken.
that'll give me a chance to talk about the dollar sign if that
And here's
happens.
another thing. Something that I like to use is context.comment. Sometimes if you're doing gray box or black box API testing, you don't know what's going to be coming back. You don't know what it looks like. So instead of hopping over to something like Postman or another, API fetching tool, you can view the data coming back in
Yeah,
your test simply by doing context.comment and then the data or the response or whatever.
yeah. So we can. Good point. So one of the things. So I see was mentioning we have this comment thing which will just let us spit out arbitrary text. So within this context thing, we can grab our response and we can grab our body, and we can just spit out whatever the body that we got back from our JSON. So let me go ahead and build that and run that again.
Seems like it was array and length too. It's good.
Yeah, I think it does. It figures that out for us. I'll talk about that after we see what this JSON body looks like.
Sort of like type coercion or something.
Yeah, it will convert. So, ooh, what is that? That's all our JSON. So that comment just took all our JSON and spit it out, so we can see what it actually gave back to us. So it gives us back underscore meta block with some information, gave us back our status code, gave us back our links, and gave us back our data, which is what I'm digging into, which is an array. So yeah, that's a super handy tool for debugging to actually see back what your response is going to be. So just to take a step back, you'll notice that I haven't been typing any comments of what these assertions should say. Flagpole will do uh, it's best to come up with text in these assertions that make sense without you having to specifically tell it. So it actually does a pretty good job here. So data exists, that's pretty descriptive. The type of data equals array, okay. Length of data is greater than 0. It did that automatically for us. As I showed you earlier, any of these that we want to override the default text, we can, as the first argument to this assertion, we can type in whatever text we want and be more descriptive. What John was mentioning earlier with dollar sign is whenever we grab anything with like find or anything else from the DOM or from our JSON body, Flagpole wraps it in this thing called an I value or value object. And the reason it does that is because it keeps track of like what it is. It keeps track of that path that we selected it in. So it doesn't actually give us like this data object isn't the raw data from the JSON object. It's actually the data wrapped in this value that keeps track of like, oh, you pulled me from data or you pulled me from article from my HTML test previously, and it kind of has that name and that context of who it is. So if I ever want to get at, when I do this dot type though, it's intelligent enough to say, oh, well, you're asserting a type or you're asserting a length against the underlying value. So you don't have to use that cognitive overhead to convert it there. It does that for you. But if you really actually want the underlying data, we have this shortcut that's just dollar sign after our object, and that's going to give us the actual object. So that would give me, I could do dollar sign and bracket 0 to grab the first element from that data object, for example. That hopefully that made sense to everybody. I mean, I'm moving a little bit fast here. Um, so,
I
yeah.
mean, there's so much you can touch on too. Now that you have an array, I like doing the every
Hmm.
method. It'll go through and check that every iteration of that array, and then you could use something like a regex to say like, and it'll match that regex too, which is, yeah, I don't know, something that I think is really powerful and really easy to do. It's in English.
Yeah,
It doesn't take a whole lot of TypeScript or jQuery or JavaScript knowledge
you're
to
gonna.
to write.
I don't remember how to use the every. So
I don't.
every's gonna assert that every item in this thing has certain things. So I don't remember how to use it though. Everyone has a name. If I spell return right, um, maybe this will work. What is this telling me? Oh, no, it's just VS Code being slow. So what we're attempting to do here, whether this actually works or not when I run it, because it's been a while since I've written every test, we want to assert something against every object within that data. So we want to make sure that every item that came back in this big array full of meats has a name, because every meat in track and field should have a name. Um, and so that allows us to do it quickly with one line. We could do a for each. We could grab the data element and we could loop over it with a for each, and we could make an assertion for every single one of those things. But the result, if I did that, would be I would have, say there's 100 meats that got returned. I'd have 100 assertions in my test, and it would just really make a really long result. But every allows us to do it with one thing. So we just say every meat should have a name. And I'm gonna run this, and again, live TV here, so hopefully
Yeah.
I'll be
That's
really.
what I like too, is not having a bloated list of
Yeah,
assertions and just saying, "Hey, yep, everything's good."
it makes it really hard to follow. So what did I do here? Actual value object. So I did something wrong. So yeah. So anyway, I'm gonna claim that I'm gonna just fast forward through this, but we have to look. If you look at the documentation, which I've already forgotten, you can figure out how to quickly do that. It'll be very similar to what I did here, but I don't remember, to be honest. Maybe if I do that, let me try that one more time, and if not, I'll pretend it didn't happen and move on.
What happened? I didn't see.
You didn't see it.
Length on line 24,
Oh,
item.name.length.
well, that definitely is a
Thanks,
problem.
Rusty.
I still don't know if that's going to be the issue, but we'll give it a shot anyway. Oh, thank you, Rusty. Okay, cool. So that actually passed. So I had spelled length wrong, which tends to be a problem. Um,
Yeah.
so essentially what we did here is we grabbed the underlying object. We used the dollar sign. I don't know if that was necessary or not, but let's say it is. I think it maybe. I don't know. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It works. So the dollar sign gave us again that underlying data object, the raw JSON array. Essentially, it gave us back that actual array, not wrapped in a value. And then so we did. If you're familiar with JavaScript, there's an every function in JavaScript that loops through arrays. It works the same way. So we're going to loop through every item in that array, and if this returns true, then it passes. If one of those returns false, then it's going to fail. Um, in addition to every, there's also a sum, which means like we expect at least one of these to pass. So that's useful. That if some of them should do things, I don't know. Did I have a none? Yeah, I do have a none. So we can do the
Yeah.
opposite, and we say, let's just flip this around real quick. We can say none of these should have a length of 0, which is essentially the same thing what we just did.
Another thing, if you like formatting, you can chain your assertions too. I love doing that.
Yeah, I can show that. Okay, it's cool. So the none works as well. So what what John was just saying is that if we don't like context, we can actually chain it like this, and we can chain it like that. We can just keep using the same context value over and over again. Essentially that's just if you think that's prettier, I don't actually think it's prettier because it gets me
Oh,
confused.
I love it.
My brain that makes my brain hurt a little bit. But you can do that. It does it supports chaining. So I'm gonna undo
It's
that now.
dry.
So one of the things that I want to mention that I won't do today is that John has created a bunch of helper objects. So as you write all these tests and you write down all these different things you want to cover, you have hundreds of different scenarios on paper in a doc that you want to cover. As you start writing those out, you'll get a lot of stuff that's redundant. You'll be like, I'm checking for the same thing over and over again. And so one of the great things is I wish I had an example easily to pull up, but you can create helper objects. So for example, next, um, you could say, again, this isn't going to work because I don't have the test here, but you could have a function that wraps all this that you use over and over again. Status should be 200 or something like that, right? Or in the before part of it, if you're doing the same login every time, you could say, I don't even know, before login as subscriber. And so John has written out these tests like this so that he doesn't have to copy and paste that code over and over again. He writes one method, one function that gives all the information about how to log in as a subscriber, and then he gives a group of assertions just like we wrote here. Basically, we take all this, wrap it up into a function, and now all of a sudden it's reusable, and you just can do next. And it also makes it very readable because you can say before we do this, log in as a subscriber. Next, we should do this. Makes very, very legible and self-documenting code that's completely dry. And if you don't know what dry means, it means don't repeat yourself, which is a core of good coding. I guess I can mention as I just typed this that we have different methods like before, actually before all, actually no, before will as part of the scenario will run before the scenario does, and we also have, as you might imagine, an after. Within the suite itself, we also have before all, which will run this once before any of the scenarios start running, and after all, as you would imagine. We also have a before each, which will run this function, whatever we put in here, before each scenario runs, which gives us a chance to add something to the scenario before it actually runs. So a lot of super powerful tools there. We also have finally, which will run after everything. Which is only, I won't get into the difference between after all and finally and success. There's a bunch of different ones. And you can also do like a failure, which counts, which runs if there's a failure. You can consult the docs, but there's all kinds of great places you can hook into to do this. One of the things that you'll probably want to do with maybe a lot of different tests, but definitely with an API test, is you want to test for the status code that came back. So I'll show you that real quick because that's useful. And then I'll kind of maybe stop talking and see if there's any more questions in the chat. So if we want to make an assertion about the response code, we can use our handy context.response and then status code equals 200. Or if it's a post and you want a 201, you can of course test for 201. So I'll just build that and run that one more time.
I like the optional response time as well too. So it should be
Yeah.
less than a second optionally, so it doesn't fail your test if it takes longer than a second, but you can still have that check on it.
What is it? What is that value? Load time?
Load time.
Yeah. So if you want to make sure your load time is less than a second, you could do assert that response.load time is less than 1,000. As John was just saying, sometimes you want to be alerted if it's less than 1,000, but you don't necessarily want your whole thing to fail. So we've added this handy optional tag that you can make that assertion optional. So if that fails, it's going to tell you it failed. Let me make this obscenely low that maybe I can compel it to fail. See what that looks like. My computer sounds like an airplane. So that's what an optional failure looks like. It has this pink X that says it failed to load in less than 30, so that we know that. Where if it was an actual failure, I'll run that again, removing the optional. You should see the whole thing fail. So that actually failed. The test suite failed. It's a red X. So there you go. Yeah, there's a lot of different directions we can go here. There's with your JSON testing, if you're testing API, there's like you can define a whole schema, like where you want to make sure that you define in one spot, everything. This is a string, this is a number, this comes back as an array, whatever. You can define all that. This should be a number between 0 and 10. You can define a schema and you can insert an entire schema against your response, which is really useful. All kinds of stuff we can do, none of which we have full time for, but um, I guess I can take this opportunity to mention that we please check out. Let me pull up another window here. All right, can we see this? Let me go back to my full screen. There we go. If you we Flagpole is on npm, so if you go to npm.js and search for Flagpole, it should not Flagpole. It should pop up for you, so you can npmi that. I want to point out that either from GitHub or from Flagpole, please check out the developer documentation, because I do take a lot of pains to try to keep this documentation updated. So there's a lot of great stuff here that we won't be able to cover today that just go through this docs. It gives you some quick starts, says, it tells you if you want to use schemas, if you want to use Puppeteer, the stuff that you need to do. Actually, I could use Puppeteer, but before I use Puppeteer, I'd actually have to npm I Puppeteer, and this is my project, and that, I don't know, I can do that if we want to, but it works. The cool thing about Puppeteer, which I'm not going to do right now again because I have to install it and everything, this test would work in Puppeteer as well. Essentially, the only thing that I do differently is change that to browser instead of HTML, and all of a sudden it's going to be a Puppeteer test. And there's some other settings we can do with a browser test. We can set our viewport that we want it to be 1280 by height 720, whatever, that you don't do with Cheerio tests. But the actual assertions are very, very similar, if not identical. Now, there's more that you can do with Puppeteer browser tests, because in the context of an HTML DOM test, you don't have forms to like select elements and click on this, although we do simulate clicks and stuff within HTML, but you can't like make sure things are visible. Like there's a lot more things that you can dive into when you do Puppeteer tests. But the base of the code, again, is very similar, and that's what we wanted. We wanted, whether you do an HTML test, an API test, Puppeteer test, we wanted to feel and even be the same. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to change this back to an HTML test, though.
We have a couple of questions in
awesome.
the chat.
What are some strengths and weaknesses of Flagpole compared to Jest and Cypress? So I'm not going to for a second badmouth Cypress, although we have had some issues internally with Cypress that we fight with. Cypress does a great job, and I'm not bad. John laughed at me when I said that. You couldn't see that he laughed. I'm not bad mouthing. Flagpole has issues too, to be clear. I'm not claiming that it doesn't. It probably has. Flagpole probably has more issues than Cypress because it's more mature and has like hundreds of people developing it versus just me right now, and John's feedback. So anyway, back to the question. So Cypress does a great job. Cypress mainly is just for the browser test, which is the equivalent of the Puppeteer test I was just talking about. It doesn't do these HTML DOM tests, which are super fast. I think maybe they're coming out with some stuff to do some API tests, but up until recently, at least they didn't support that. We can also, it's super cool. I wish I had time to show you images, because we have, automatic image resizing on MileSplit, like our articles. So all of our images should be a certain dimensions. We can actually go through very easily with Flagpole and load all the images and then do a simple check on those images and make sure they're the right height and width. And it does that without loading the entire image, which keeps it fast. It loads like the first few bytes of the image, so it knows the height and width and make sure it's image / JPEG type and certain dimensions, everything. There's just things that Cypress didn't do for us, and we were going to end up having to use Cypress and something else. With Cypress for these things and these for API testing, and these for whatever other testing. And so I would say the power of it is that you can do it in just one thing. And you guys correct me if wrong here. Because you also mentioned Jest. Jest is great. I use Jest for unit tests within the code. You're actually making running the actual code and making sure functions come back the same way. That's a different type of test than we're talking about here. We're actually this as well as Cypress is testing kind of the end-to-end functional testing of the end result versus usually Jest, Mocha, whatever you're writing unit tests against lines of code. Although I'm sure maybe there's ways you can test the same thing. I just out of the box, I think Flagpole is easier to do all these things without having to install like Mocha and Jest and this and that and trying to patchwork a bunch of things together to make it actually work. You can just install Flagpole and all of a sudden it works. Question two, why take the time to build your own testing app versus one of the big names? So I think I basically already answered that, and we talked about that at the beginning. We do use Cypress, to be clear. Some of our teams are still using Cypress, and maybe eventually we'll be using Flagpole and all of them. But no, I mean, if people want to use Cypress and they only need the things that Cypress does well, go for it. But for us, again, our goals were a unified thing that we could do across all these different types of tests, that we could run fast, that we could run everywhere from the dev's local machine before they're even allowed to push with using a Git hook to running, in Docker to running everywhere. It just met our needs really well, and the native TypeScript and the simple syntax that QA can pick. All the things I mentioned earlier are the reasons. And the third question, do you plan to promote it as its own product outside of ODABs where you've shared? It's an open source project. Those things I find usually either really thrive or get nobody else using it. So right now, nobody else is using it but FloSports. If other people start to pick it up and like it and use it, that's great. Hopefully, it won't take up too much of my time. I'm a little bit concerned that I'm going to promote this and it will take off, and um, and that might be a bad thing. But no, if we get a community around it and people start using it and submitting PRs and submitting issues, then that would be cool. I really enjoy that for the most part. So yeah, I mean, we're promoting it, and if hopefully people use it outside of ODevs, and it'd be great to hear some feedback about it. All right, have any other questions in the chat?
That about covers what I see.
Okay. Hey, John, anything else that you want to talk about? Let me jump back to the John cam.
I'll shamelessly plug into my run scope to Flagpole migrator
Oh
tool that
yeah.
I built this week. If you're on run scope or BlazeMeter and you want to get your Flagpole suites dynamically created, I have a solution for you. It hasn't been tested outside of what I use it for, but if you want to talk, I'm open and excited to see, how we can get you up and running with Flagpole if you're interested in a day,
Yeah,
It's free, it's open source.
I was so excited about that because, as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of tests in RunScope and Ghost Inspector. Next time you have to write it for Ghost Inspector. Um, but we were going to have to manually port those over from RunScope, which is our API testing, to Flagpole. But with that tool that John just wrote, it's awesome. It just converts them all in bulk.
I specialize in automation, so it would hurt
Yeah.
to migrate by hand.
Uh-huh. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, would love. I'll give a few more minutes if anybody has questions. But again, please go through the documentation. There's a lot of powerful things. Again, or just without the documentation, just start typing in context, and you type in context response, and you can say, oh, I can get back the body, I can get back my cookies, I can get back the final URL. So final URL is pretty cool because sometimes we have some redirects that go on, and you want to make sure that you end up on the final right page after the redirects, like. For example, if you try to get to a paywalled page within MileSplit, like we're going to kick you out to the paywall if you're not logged in. So we want to make sure that if we go in with a non-logged in user, like it kicks them back to the paywall page. So, final URL. So, poke around with the autocomplete and you can find, all the different things that you can do. You can check response types. You can do all these different things.
I love the environment setup too, running them in Docker containers, running them in CI, running them on the Git hooks.
Yeah.
Because and Rusty was mentioning here the control the output. You can do a tag -o JSON, get your output control, and then he's built a incoming webhook with Slack where he can run his Flagpole tests in the cloud every 5 minutes, and then if there's a failure, you can have it actually ping your Slack channel for your team or wherever your test is failing, and get reports from there too. So
Yeah. So if I run this command with a -o JSON and I added a -h, I thought that was supposed to hide my header, but maybe I'm remembering the command wrong. Um, but rather than getting the text output, as John was just describing, one of our other developers wrote this automation tool that runs it on a schedule or on demand. Like he built, his name is Rusty, and he's also in Orlando and also awesome. He built this front end for it that he called Boy Scout, because Flagpole, Boy Scout, I don't know, it made sense in his head. And it runs it like on a schedule or on demand through a web tool. You can push a button in the browser and it runs it and gives you the results. But he didn't want to parse the text output from Flagpole, so he used the /o JSON to have our output from all these tests output in JSON, and now he can parse that really easily in his code. So there's a lot of stuff that CLI can do as well, that you can build your own automation on top of it. So yeah, that's super cool. If you just type in Flagpole too, you see a lot of different commands that you can run. A few examples. There's also in the docs on the website, you can also see some of those other examples. Yeah. There's also a very basic web service. If I do Flagpole serve, I can show that. It's not great yet, but let me pull it over into the screen where you can see it. So it serves up this very simple web UI where you can see what tests you have set up. You can do a little bit of manipulation, create new suites here from this web UI if you prefer that to the CLI. So, we're trying to do a lot with it, and there's a lot more that I want to do in the future. Right now, we're just kind of iterating on it and kind of building out stuff as we need it. But, again, we're open the doors if you guys want to come in and do your own PRs or file some issues or feature requests, have at it. I'll just in the Flagpole JSON, just you can see how some of the directories are configured. You can see our environments. So this is how you can map your different directories based on what environment you run, what domains can be hit. Um, I don't know, man. There's a lot of different stuff we can show, but I think unless there's more questions, I'm done. All right, y'all. Well, I appreciate everybody for joining us. Let me bring up our presentation again with the contact information in case you mentioned you missed that earlier. So where's my contact info? Let me scroll back through my slide just in case anybody missed that. There we go. All right, so feel free to hit me up on any of those forums, and we can talk a little bit more about this. Find the project on GitHub as well under Flagpole on GitHub, and you can check out the source code. You can file some issues, and also don't forget about hitting up John and bothering him on LinkedIn. He also loves spam emails, so you can sign him up for all kinds of mailing lists. There's his email address right there.
I'll just automate a block for him.
and subscribe to FloSports. We could really use a few new subscriptions during COVID-19. So if you want to help us out, and we also have some really great content when there's sports around, but we're doing our best in the meantime as well. So check out FloSports. In the future, once the clouds lift and we're hiring again, hell, we'd love to talk to you about maybe coming to work here at FloSports. John was somebody that we found from our ODEVs group, and I was meaning to switch over to this, and I thought I was on it. I was like scrolling through different things. So
no, you're on John TV.
I was on John TV. So here's John's contact info. I was just saying to hit him up. There's his information, and then there's my information. But I was saying if once we get through this crisis, and hopefully we'll be hiring again. So we can talk about future careers at Flow, or if you just want to shoot the breeze and just talk about coding or talk about advice, getting your career started, whatever, talk about QA, hit me up. I'd love to chat. Yeah. All right, y'all. Thanks, everybody. Have a fantastic day.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everyone.
Later.